Being a professional isn't about the money you make, the position you hold, your level of expertise, or fame. It's the motivation and the attitude you bring to your work, a desire for always learning and improving, and balancing your creative output with getting the business done. Welcome and join the Creating Pros. Hi, and welcome back to Creating Pros. I'm your host, Jim Nettles. And this week, I want to talk about something that's really kind of critical to all of us, to our creative endeavors, to our creative businesses. And that's this idea of money. Specifically, I want to dive into and talk about how do we make sure we've got the funding we need when we're trying to launch a new project, launch a new business. We're trying to invest deeper into the business to maybe grow something, do a different project, do a different product, something like that. And I want to dive into the idea of something that all too often we don't think about, we ignore, or maybe don't even know that's out there. And it's free money. Well, what do I mean by free money? Nothing's ever entirely free, right? I say this quite frequently, and that's true. But a lot of the time we can find that there are some definitive options around grants. When we look at grants, usually we don't necessarily think about these. Especially in terms of creative space. But in truth, the creative space is one of the places that has a lot of grant opportunities. And one of the things I want to dive into today is really how do we know if it's a good fit? How do we dive into it and know if it's something that can work for us? Now, a couple of things I want to say before we go into it too far. The reason I say it's free money, but there can always be strings attached. And number two, it may not cost you anything. You may not have to repay it because, again, we're talking about grants. But that doesn't mean that it can't potentially be an investment of time and research and other things like that to actually go out there and get the funds. Now, this being said, it can be one of those ways that can be very, very productive, very lucrative, and really allow you to go ahead and get paid upfront for projects that you're working on. So what are grants? Let's actually start there first. Well, a grant is money that comes from a person, a foundation, a company, some sort of an endeavor that comes in and offers money and potentially other resources to help you fund a project, to help fund growth or establishing a given creative business, or other sorts of uses. And the arts are one of the places that a lot of the time we find are both heavily funded by grants, and also there's a lot of opportunities for grants out in that space. And the grants, the important things about this are if you meet the conditions of the grant, these are typically monies you do not have to pay back. And that's what makes it a grant versus, say, a loan or something else along those lines. And the reason that grants can be really helpful is because if you meet those conditions and you abide by the conditions of the grant and the contract, it's money that goes into your pocket to help fund the project. So how do I go about finding a grant, for example? Well, the first thing you have to know is who are you, right? Who are you? Can you abide by the terms of a given contract when you get money that has conditions attached to it? And so if you have done that soul searching yourself and you have a pretty good idea that, yes, you can, the next thing you want to look at is what is the project you're trying to fund? So, for example, let's say you're trying to kick off a book project, something that is very specific. Well, if that book project, and these are plenty of these out there for fiction, nonfiction, all sorts of things. But let's say that you're doing a book project which is designed around own voices of Louisiana. Well, if you've got a book project that is the own voices of Louisiana and you defined it, you know how many stories are in it, you know if they're all yours, are you putting together a collection or an anthology? Do you have to go do interviews? Well, once you know that and you've set the parameters around what you want to do, then you have to start searching for and hunting for what are your grant opportunities. And this involves, let's be obvious, Google. I mean, if you want to start on the internet, you can start looking for grant opportunities. And some of them are quite broad and quite flexible. Others you're going to find are very restrictive and meant for very specific purposes. Well, as you start digging and filtering through, and this is one of those things that can be quite time consuming, is to go filter through all the options, all the different kinds of grants, the different providers. Then you start looking at the criteria and trying to drill down into them. Well, then if you start building a list of ones that you think you meet those criteria, Then the next thing you want to look at is what is the foundation or the organization behind it? Are they credible? Are they reliable? Do they have a history of funding projects? Do they have any questionable things about them? Are there any issues with them as an operating entity? Are you finding any stories out there in the news that brings up something problematic? So if you get past that point where you know who you are, you have a project, and you've now come up with a list of grant opportunities, you can start looking to see, number one, how much the potential opportunities are for. A lot of the time, they are for a range of funds. The second thing you have to look at are the criteria. What are the criteria that the grant is operating under? So, for example, it may be very restrictive. It may come and say that it is for specific operating expenses, or maybe it is to send you on a research trip somewhere. Maybe these resources have to be used very specifically in terms of covering living expenses. Or maybe this grant is to send you to a conference to help build certain skill sets, or to even promote the work. Once you know what those requirements are, and you understand, do you have to provide receipts? Do you have to document it some way, shape, or form? Once you go through and understand the criteria of what the money is for and how you can use that money, and most importantly, what happens if you don't use all of the money, or what happens if you need the money in other ways? Well, again, this is one of those things you have to look at and understand. What are you trying to accomplish with the project? What do you need money for? And can you use the money appropriately for your own project that meets the conditions of the grant? Now, if the answer to all of that is yes, then it becomes a process of actually going through completing the grant application. It may be fairly simple, or it could be very complicated, complex, and take a lot of time to go through and do it. Typically, the larger the amount of money, the more complex the process, the more juried it could be. If you're going out for a grant for $250 that will help fund a given kind of book project, the grant proposal could be a couple of pages. If you're looking for something that is, $10, $20, $50,000 or more, then those grants tend to have a lot more restrictions, and also tend to be a lot more complex and ask for a lot more information. Now, once you've gone through the grant process, another one of the things you need to understand is typically these things are not necessarily fast. A grant could run once a year, or it could run once a quarter. It could be a one-time grant going through because of for some given reason. So once you look at that, you have to understand, will the money be there in time for you to use it as you need for it to be? Or can you front the money knowing that potentially this money would be coming in the form of a grant? Then once you've submitted the grant, you sit and wait. And then once you receive those funds, you have to make sure that you live up to the terms and conditions of the grant. Now, all of this sounds pretty simple, and in a lot of ways it really is, but it can be very time consuming, and sometimes it can be quite complicated. If you need help, and one of the other things that I would recommend you do is make sure you do read all the fine details and terms and conditions of the grant. So let's say, for example, you're looking at a grant that is looking for artists to create work to go into a particular venue. For example, a museum is offering a grant, but fundamentally what they're doing is they're offering a grant for people to create work that they then have a right to acquire. So if by creating the work, you have to offer it to that establishment, that museum, whatever the case may be first, well, again, this is one of those conditions you have to know and be aware of. So a lot of the time you can see and find a lot of conditions around the particular grants. And if you're not sure or understanding of it, it really can be worthwhile to consult an attorney, consult a consultant, somebody that will be able to walk you through what all the terms and conditions really mean, just like any other contract. And so hopefully there's good luck for you on this front of working with grants. Again, it's very different from a loan. Make sure you have looked at the terms and conditions. One of the other things, just to sort of throw this out there, is, for example, let's say you want to attend a writing conference, you want to attend an artist conference. You need money or funding to get to a show somewhere. You also may find that there are scholarships that will help support you in these activities. Generally, scholarships are much more for educational opportunities, travel opportunities, research opportunities, more so than, say, funding a project. But you will sometimes even find a scholarship that helps you do certain things along those lines. There are some very specific kind of legal descriptions that are different between the two, but generally, a scholarship is there to help you with an educational or travel opportunity, whereas a grant is there for much more of a project type of basis and tends to be available for a much wider funding use. So until next time, as you're starting to look at how you're going to fund that next project and you're debating crowdfunding or self-funding or however you're approaching it, keep in mind that grants are out there and they're available. And a lot of the time we forget that they're there. And some of them can actually be quite easy to get. And often you can get multiple grants for the same project. And even if the worst case scenario is you use it to help fund creation of the project and basically it's pre-sales for you, it's always a good thing to have those options available. So until next time, this has been Creating Pros, and I'm your host, Jim Nettles.